The concert hall was quiet, its golden lights dimmed as the evening cleaning shift began. A soft hum of the vacuum filled the air, mixing with the faint echo of a melody played hours earlier. The guests were gone, the applause had faded, and now it was time for the unseen workers to take over, the ones who made the place sparkle again before morning. Among them was Daniel, the janitor everyone knew but no one really noticed. He moved carefully, almost respectfully, through the hall, sweeping the marble floors like someone who understood the beauty of silence. Every corner of that hall held memories of grand performances. Daniel had been there for years, quietly cleaning after orchestras, pianists, and world-famous singers. To most, he was just a part of the background, the man with the mop who came after the magic ended. The musicians often ignored him. Some nodded politely when he passed, but most didn't bother. The conductor, Mr. Rowland, was especially known for his arrogance. He had little patience for anyone outside his circle of musicians and sponsors. To him, Daniel was invisible, until the night he caught him standing near the grand piano. It happened after a long rehearsal. The orchestra had just finished a difficult session, and the musicians were leaving one by one. The grand piano, polished and shining, stood quietly at the center of the stage. Daniel, holding his mop, walked closer, almost drawn by an unseen force. He placed the mop aside and looked at the keys. For a moment he just stood there, lost in thought. Then his fingers brushed the surface of a few keys, softly pressing one note. It echoed faintly, hanging in the air. He smiled a little, a rare thing for him. But his moment didn't last. Mr. Rowland, who had returned to grab his forgotten score, saw him from behind the curtain. The sound of that single note caught his attention. His footsteps echoed as he walked toward the stage. "Hey!" Rowland's sharp voice broke the stillness. "What do you think you're doing?" Daniel froze. He stepped back immediately. "I'm sorry, sir. I was just what?" The conductor interrupted, his tone full of mockery. "You're just a janitor, not a pianist. Leave the instruments alone. They're worth more than your entire salary." The words stung, but Daniel said nothing. He only nodded, picked up his mop, and stepped down from the stage quietly. Rowland shook his head, muttering something under his breath before leaving again. The moment passed, but it stayed in Daniel's mind. Not because of the insult, he was used to that, but because of the truth behind Rowland's words. Yes, he was a janitor, but he hadn't always been. Long ago, Daniel's life was very different. Music wasn't just a dream. It was his world. He had spent years studying, practicing, performing. The piano was more than an instrument. It was his way of speaking to the world. But that world had ended one terrible day, and he never played publicly again. The only music he allowed himself now was the faint memory of melodies that lived quietly inside his mind. Every night after cleaning, he would linger near the stage. When everyone was gone, and only the dim emergency lights glowed, he would sometimes sit on the piano bench. He never played loudly, just a few notes here and there. Soft, hidden music that only the empty hall could hear. One night, as he played a few quiet chords, one of the younger stage workers, a kind boy named Leo, walked in. He froze, listening. The sound was beautiful, sad, but full of life. When Daniel noticed him, he stopped immediately and stood up. "I didn't mean to interrupt," Leo said quickly. "That was amazing. I didn't know you could play like that." Daniel smiled faintly and shook his head. "Just something I used to do a long time ago. Nothing important." But Leo couldn't forget what he heard. The next day he mentioned it quietly to another stagehand. Soon whispers began to spread among the backstage crew. They said the janitor could play the piano better than the musicians on stage. Some laughed, saying it was just a rumor. Others wondered if it was true. Daniel heard the whispers but ignored them. He had learned that peace came from silence, not attention. A week later, the orchestra prepared for one of its biggest performances of the season. A famous pianist was supposed to arrive from another city, but a sudden storm delayed all flights. The concert was scheduled for the next evening, and the conductor was furious. He shouted at everyone pacing across the stage, blaming the staff for something none of them could control. "This is a disaster," Rowland shouted. "We can't perform without a pianist. The tickets are sold out, sponsors are coming, and now we have nothing." The musicians exchanged nervous glances. Some suggested postponing the concert. Others said they could play without the piano part. Rowland dismissed them all angrily. It would sound ridiculous without it. From the corner of the hall, Daniel was quietly mopping the floor, pretending not to hear. But deep inside something stirred, a small flame he thought had died long ago. When the rehearsal ended in chaos, the musicians left, and the hall emptied once again. Daniel finished cleaning the aisles and walked slowly toward the piano. His reflection shimmered on its polished surface. He sat down gently, his hands trembling a little. For a long moment he didn't play. Then, as if something took over, his fingers began to move. The first notes were soft and unsure, but then they grew stronger. The melody that filled the hall was hauntingly beautiful, a mix of sadness, love, and hope. It was a piece he had written years ago before his life changed. Each note carried a piece of his soul, each chord a story untold. He played not for fame, not for anyone else, but for himself. Unbeknownst to him, one of the violinists, Clara, had returned to pick up her forgotten bow. She stood by the door, frozen, listening. She couldn't believe what she was hearing. The janitor, the quiet man who swept the floors every night, was playing with the skill and heart of a true maestro. When he finished, the final note lingered in the air, fading slowly into silence. Clara clapped softly, tears in her eyes. Daniel turned, startled. "Please don't tell anyone," he said quietly. "That was incredible," she whispered. "How could you hide something like that?" He gave a tired smile. "Because sometimes hiding is easier than explaining." Clara nodded slowly. She didn't ask questions. She simply left, carrying the secret with her. But secrets in a concert hall don't stay hidden for long. The next day, a few more musicians had heard about the mysterious midnight pianist. They started teasing Daniel playfully, not believing it was true. One of them even joked, "Maybe he can replace the guest pianist." Roland overheard and burst into laughter. "Oh yes, that would be quite a show," he said sarcastically. The janitor on the grand piano. "Perhaps he can play while sweeping too." The room filled with laughter, but Daniel didn't react. He simply smiled and continued cleaning. Yet that evening, something unexpected happened. The guest pianist called to confirm he couldn't make it at all. The storm had grounded flights for 2 more days. The concert couldn't be canceled. The audience was already arriving in town. Everyone was in panic again. Roland slammed his baton on the podium in frustration. "What am I supposed to do now?" he shouted. That's when Leo, the stage worker, hesitated and spoke up quietly. "Sir, maybe we should let Daniel try." Roland turned sharply. "Daniel, the janitor? Are you joking?" "No, sir," Leo replied firmly. "You should hear him play. He's really good. Better than anyone I've heard." Roland stared at him in disbelief. The musicians exchanged awkward glances. The idea sounded ridiculous. But with no other options left and time running out, Roland sighed. "Fine," he said finally. "Let him try for 5 minutes. If it's as bad as I expect, we forget this nonsense." When Leo told Daniel, he froze. "Me, play for them?" he asked, unsure. "Yes," Leo said. "You have nothing to lose. Just show them who you are." Daniel looked at the empty stage and then at his own hands. They had grown older, rougher, from years of work. But deep down, he knew those hands still remembered. That night, as the orchestra waited, Daniel slowly walked onto the stage. The musicians whispered among themselves. Roland leaned back with crossed arms, clearly expecting to be disappointed. Daniel sat at the piano, took a deep breath, and placed his fingers on the keys. The first sound he made changed everything. It was soft but alive, a melody that drew every ear toward him. His fingers moved with grace and power, creating music that felt like light breaking through clouds. Within seconds, the laughter stopped. The musicians forgot to breathe. The janitor had become someone else, someone extraordinary. The conductor's smirk faded. He stood still, watching, realizing that he wasn't listening to a janitor at all. He was witnessing an artist, one whose music spoke louder than any title or uniform ever could. When Daniel lifted his hands from the keys, the hall was silent. No one dared to speak. The only sound was the quiet hum of the lights above, as if the entire room itself was still trying to catch its breath. The room was completely still after Daniel finished playing. For a long moment, no one spoke. The echo of his last note seemed to float in the air like it didn't want to leave. The orchestra members exchanged glances, unsure what to say. Some looked amazed, others ashamed that they had ever laughed at him. The conductor, Roland, stood frozen in place. He had expected a clumsy attempt, not a masterpiece. Daniel kept his eyes down, his hands resting gently on the piano keys. He wasn't waiting for praise or applause. He simply wanted to help. but the silence that followed felt heavier than he expected. When he finally turned to look at them, his eyes were calm and humble. "I'm sorry if I overstepped," he said quietly. "I just wanted to make sure the notes sounded right for the performance." Roland cleared his throat, still unsure of what to say. "That was unexpected," he muttered. "Where did you learn to play like that?" Daniel hesitated, then gave a small smile. "A long time ago, before I worked here." There was something in his tone that made everyone curious, but no one dared to ask more. The conductor, still pretending to be composed, turned to the others and said, "We'll take a short break." But as he walked away, it was clear that Daniel's music had shaken something deep inside him. After everyone left, Daniel stayed behind to wipe down the piano keys the same way he did every night. He moved slowly, his fingers tracing the edge of the instrument with care. The hall was quiet again, but this time it felt different. It felt alive, as if the walls themselves were still humming with the sound he had created. The next morning, whispers spread quickly among the staff. The story of the janitor who played like a professional pianist was all anyone talked about. Some doubted it, thinking it was exaggerated. Others wanted to see it for themselves. By noon, even the concert hall's manager had heard about it. When Daniel arrived for his evening shift, he felt the curious eyes following him. People greeted him politely now, some even smiled, which was unusual. He didn't like attention, but he couldn't escape it. While he swept the corridors, a few musicians passed by offering compliments. "That was incredible last night," one said softly. Daniel just nodded and smiled. "Thank you," he replied, and continued working. That night, the conductor stayed late in his office. The sound of Daniel's playing wouldn't leave his mind. Every time he tried to focus on his sheet music, he heard those notes again. The emotion, the precision, the soul. He finally stood up and walked out into the empty hall, stopping in front of the piano. He ran his fingers along the keys almost reluctantly. He had spent his whole life commanding orchestras, training under famous maestros. Yet the janitor's performance had made him feel small. He muttered to himself, "Who are you really, Daniel?" The following day, the decision about the concert had to be made. The guest pianist still couldn't arrive due to the storm, and postponing would mean losing sponsors and refunds. Roland sat in the meeting room with the manager and some senior musicians. They argued for an hour, but no one had a solution. Then one of the violinists spoke up hesitantly. "We could ask Daniel to play," she suggested. The room went silent. The manager frowned. "The janitor? Are you serious?" "Yes," she said. "You should have heard him. He knows the music and he plays with heart. The audience wouldn't care who he is if the music moves them." Roland looked down, thinking hard. He didn't like the idea of letting a janitor perform in front of hundreds of people, but he also couldn't deny what he had witnessed. Finally, he sighed and said, "If he agrees, we'll give him a chance." That evening, Roland found Daniel cleaning near the stage. "Daniel," he began, his tone softer than before, "we need to talk." Daniel straightened up. "Of course, sir." Roland crossed his arms. "The guest pianist can't make it. The concert is tomorrow night. The orchestra and I were thinking, maybe you could fill in." Daniel blinked, unsure he had heard correctly. "Me?" he asked, surprised. "But I'm not a professional anymore. It's been years since I played on stage." "I know," Roland said, "but you're the only one who can save this performance. You already know the music. If you play like you did yesterday, the audience will never forget it." Daniel stood in silence. The idea scared him. He had promised himself long ago never to return to the stage. Too many memories waited there, memories of what he had lost. But there was also a small spark in him, one that had been buried for years. Maybe this was his chance to let it breathe again. "I'll do it," he said finally. His voice was calm, but his heart was pounding. That night he stayed late, sitting at the piano once more. The hall was empty except for the sound of rain tapping against the roof. He practiced quietly, his fingers gliding over the keys with a mix of strength and tenderness. Each note carried emotion, joy, pain, hope. Sometimes he paused and closed his eyes, remembering the people who once listened to him play. He smiled sadly, then continued. A few musicians who stayed behind listened from the shadows, moved by the sincerity of his playing. There was no showmanship in it, no arrogance, only truth. One of them whispered, "He doesn't play for applause. He plays because he loves it." The next morning, the concert hall buzzed with excitement. Word had spread that a mysterious pianist would perform that night. Some audience members were curious, others skeptical. They didn't know who he was, only that something unusual was about to happen. Backstage, Daniel dressed in a simple black suit the manager had found for him. He looked at himself in the mirror, almost not recognizing the man staring back. The last time he had worn a suit like this was years ago, on a night that had changed everything. His hands trembled slightly, but he took a deep breath and steadied them. Roland entered the room holding the concert program. "You ready?" he asked. Daniel nodded. "As ready as I'll ever be." Roland hesitated. "Listen, about before. When I said those things to you, I was wrong. You've got something special and I should have seen that sooner." Daniel smiled kindly. "It's all right, sir. Sometimes people only hear the music when it finally plays." The conductor looked at him, surprised by the words, then gave a small nod. "Let's give them a performance they'll never forget." As the orchestra tuned their instruments, the audience settled into their seats. The grand hall shimmered under the golden lights. The energy in the air was thick with curiosity. When Daniel walked onto the stage, a quiet murmur spread through the crowd. No one recognized him. To them, he was just a man walking toward the piano. He sat down, closed his eyes, and took a deep breath. The conductor raised his baton and the first soft notes began. The orchestra followed, but soon it became clear. Daniel was leading them, not the other way around. His playing was alive, full of emotion and honesty. The music rose and fell like a heartbeat, each note carrying meaning. The audience leaned forward, drawn in by the sound. As the final movement built, Daniel poured his soul into the piano. It wasn't just a performance, it was a story of loss, silence, and rediscovery. When the last chord echoed, he let his hands rest gently on the keys. For a moment, no one moved. Then the hall erupted in applause. People stood, clapping, cheering, shouting his name. Daniel looked up, overwhelmed. His eyes glistened with tears, but he smiled. For the first time in years, he felt alive again. Roland walked over and shook his hand firmly. "You've reminded us all why we play," he said sincerely. That night, Daniel didn't go home right away. He stayed in the empty hall long after everyone left. He walked slowly across the stage, listening to the silence. It wasn't empty anymore. It was full of memories, full of music. He sat at the piano once more, but this time he didn't play. He just smiled quietly and whispered, "Thank you." Outside, the rain had stopped. The sky was clear, and the moonlight shone through the tall windows, bathing the piano in a soft glow. The janitor who once swept the floors of the concert hall had become its brightest star, not because of fame, but because he dared to let his music speak again. The next morning, the concert hall was still buzzing with talk about what had happened the night before. Everyone who had been there couldn't stop talking about the janitor who had played like a master. Even people who hadn't attended the concert were now curious. The story spread quickly, first among the staff, then to the local newspapers, and soon across the entire city. Daniel arrived for work early, as he always did. He wasn't used to being the center of attention, and the sudden fame made him a little uncomfortable. When he entered the hall, the guards at the door smiled at him warmly. One said, "You were amazing last night, sir." The word "sir" caught him off guard. He nodded politely and thanked them before quietly walking inside. Inside the main hall, a few workers were already cleaning up from the night's event. They stopped what they were doing when they saw him. "Daniel, you were incredible," one of them said, clapping him on the shoulder. "You made everyone cry last night." Another worker added, "Even the conductor couldn't stop talking about you." Daniel smiled shyly. "I'm glad the performance went well," he said. "That's all that matters." But deep down, something had changed inside him. Playing on that stage again had woken a part of him he thought was gone forever. It reminded him of who he used to be, the man who lived and breathed music, who played not for fame, but because his heart couldn't stay silent. Later that day, the hall manager called him to the office. "Daniel, we've had several calls from the media," the manager said, sounding both excited and nervous. "People want to interview you. They want to know your story." Daniel frowned slightly. "My story?" he asked quietly. "Yes," the manager continued. "They're calling you the hidden maestro. Isn't that amazing? The world wants to know how a janitor became a star overnight." Daniel shook his head. "I'm not a star," he said softly. "I just played the piano. That's all." The manager smiled awkwardly. Well, whatever you call it, people are inspired by you. Maybe it's time they heard what you have to say. Daniel left the office deep in thought. He walked down the empty hallway and stopped in front of the piano on the main stage. The lid was closed, the keys hidden beneath. He gently placed his hand on it as if greeting an old friend. For a moment he thought about everything he had lost, the life, the music, and the people who once filled his days. He had kept it all buried for so long. Maybe sharing his story wasn't such a bad thing after all. The next few days passed quickly. A small local paper wrote the first article about him, calling him the man who turned silence into a symphony. Soon after, a TV station came to film a short piece. They asked him about his past, about how he had ended up as a janitor. He didn't like talking about the painful parts, but he spoke honestly. "I used to play," he said simply, "but sometimes life takes turns you don't expect. I stopped performing a long time ago. I needed peace. I found it here." The reporter asked, "Do you plan to perform again?" Daniel looked at the camera for a moment, then smiled. "I don't know," he replied. "Maybe music isn't something you plan. Maybe it finds you when the time is right." When the segment aired, thousands of people were touched by his humility. Messages poured in from across the country, letters, emails, and even small gifts. People thanked him for reminding them that it's never too late to follow your passion. Some said his story gave them the courage to pick up their old dreams again. Meanwhile, inside the concert hall, life slowly returned to normal. The orchestra prepared for their next performance, but something was different now. Daniel wasn't just the janitor anymore. The musicians treated him with respect. Some even asked him for advice on phrasing and rhythm. Roland, the conductor, began to see him not as a worker, but as an equal. One evening, Roland approached Daniel as he was cleaning the stage. "You've given us something we didn't know we were missing," he said sincerely. "You reminded us what music is really about." Daniel smiled modestly. "Thank you, sir. I only played what I felt." Roland hesitated. "I'd like you to play again with us. Maybe not as a one-time thing, but as part of the orchestra. We could arrange a special concert featuring you." Daniel paused, his mop still in hand. "You mean perform again?" "Yes," Roland replied. "You belong on that stage." The idea was both exciting and frightening. Daniel had spent so many years avoiding the spotlight. The stage had once been a place of joy, but also the place where his life had fallen apart. He wasn't sure he was ready to face it again. That night he couldn't sleep. He sat by the small window of his modest apartment, looking out at the city lights. The sounds of cars, the distant hum of life, it all reminded him of how much time had passed. He closed his eyes and remembered his last concert from years ago. The night everything changed. He had been performing in a grand hall, much like the one he worked in now. His wife had been there, sitting in the front row, smiling proudly. But after that night, tragedy struck. The accident took her away, and with her, the music inside him. From that moment, he couldn't bear to touch the piano again. He had walked away from fame, from friends, from everything, but now standing in front of that same kind of stage, hearing people applaud for him again, something had healed inside him. Maybe playing again wasn't about fame or recognition. It was about finding peace with his past. The next morning, he found Roland waiting near the stage. "I'll do it," Daniel said quietly. Roland smiled with relief. "Good. We'll prepare everything." News of another concert spread quickly, and this time it was official. Daniel would perform as a featured pianist alongside the orchestra. Tickets sold out within hours. People from all over wanted to see the man who had gone from janitor to musician overnight. As the big night approached, Daniel practiced every day after work. The orchestra stayed late to rehearse with him. They admired how he played, not just with skill, but with emotion that seemed to flow straight from his heart. Even the younger musicians who once giggled at him now watched in awe, learning from his sincerity. The night of the concert arrived. The hall was packed. Every seat was filled, and the audience buzzed with anticipation. Daniel stood backstage, adjusting his sleeves nervously. Roland came over and placed a hand on his shoulder. "Remember," he said softly, "you're not proving anything to anyone tonight. Just play. That's all you've ever needed to do." Daniel nodded. "Thank you." When he stepped onto the stage, the audience erupted in applause. He bowed humbly and sat at the piano. The first few notes echoed through the hall, gentle and graceful. The orchestra followed, their sound blending perfectly with his. Together they created something magical. Every note told a story. Every pause carried meaning. The audience was completely silent, captured by the beauty of the music. Some closed their eyes, others held their breath, afraid to miss a single moment. When the final chord faded, the silence was broken by thunderous applause. People stood to their feet, clapping and cheering. Some even wiped away tears. Daniel stood and bowed deeply, overwhelmed by emotion. He had not only played music, he had shared his heart. After the concert, journalists rushed to interview him again, but he politely declined. He didn't want headlines or fame. All he wanted was to keep playing and to bring comfort to others through his music. When everyone left, Daniel stayed behind once more. The hall was quiet, filled with the soft echo of what had just happened. He sat at the piano, touching the keys lightly, smiling to himself. For the first time in years, he felt complete. He whispered to the empty room, "Thank you for waiting for me." Outside, the stars shone brightly over the city. Inside, the man who was once a janitor had reclaimed his purpose, not through pride or glory, but through the simple power of music and the strength of the human spirit. The days that followed Daniel's second concert were a whirlwind. The world seemed to have shifted around him, yet his life at the concert hall remained familiar and comforting. Every morning he arrived early to clean, sweep, and polish, just as he always had. But now people noticed him. They greeted him with respect and admiration, and while Daniel appreciated it, he never let it change who he was. One afternoon, while dusting the grand piano, he noticed a young girl sitting in the audience section. She watched him intently, her small notebook open on her lap. He paused, curious. She didn't move or speak, only scribbled furiously in her book. After a few minutes, she stood and approached him hesitantly. "Excuse me," she said softly. "I heard you play the other night." "It was beautiful." Daniel smiled gently. "Thank you, young lady." She hesitated, then asked, "Will you teach me? I want to play like you someday." For a moment, Daniel was quiet. He hadn't thought about teaching in years, but something in her eyes reminded him of his younger self. The hunger, the passion, the need to make music. "I can show you a few things," he said slowly. "But only if you promise to practice every day." She nodded eagerly. "I promise." And so in the quiet hours of the evening, Daniel began teaching her. He guided her hands over the keys, showing her the right finger positions, the subtle movements needed to bring out emotion in each note. She was a quick learner, her small fingers dancing across the piano with an enthusiasm Daniel hadn't seen in a long time. As he taught her, Daniel realized something he hadn't felt in years. Joy. The joy of sharing music, of passing it on to someone who truly wanted to learn. He found himself smiling more, laughing softly when she struggled and then succeeded. It reminded him that music was never just about performance, it was about connection. Meanwhile, Roland, the conductor, had started to include Daniel more formally in the orchestra rehearsals. He watched Daniel with growing respect, noticing how effortlessly he communicated with the musicians, guiding them with subtle cues and expressions. The orchestra began to rely on him in ways they hadn't before, and slowly, Daniel became a central figure within the hall. One evening, as they were rehearsing for an upcoming performance, a minor accident occurred. The lead violinist injured her hand, leaving the section in disarray. Without hesitation, Daniel stepped in. He knew the piece intimately and began playing the violin part on the piano, guiding the rest of the orchestra through the section seamlessly. The musicians exchanged astonished glances. They had never seen a janitor handle such a crisis with grace and expertise. Roland, standing at the podium, couldn't hide his amazement. "Daniel," he said quietly during a break, "I never thought anyone could do what you just did." "You're incredible." Daniel shook his head modestly. "I'm just helping," he replied, but Roland understood. Daniel wasn't just helping. He was leading, teaching, and inspiring. The conductor began to realize that he had underestimated this man for years, seeing only the uniform, not the person behind it. The young girl continued to learn under Daniel's guidance, and her progress was remarkable. Her parents, initially skeptical about her unusual mentor, saw the change in her. She was more confident, disciplined, and passionate. Music had awakened something in her that Daniel recognized immediately, the same fire he had carried as a child. One night after a long teaching session, Daniel sat alone at the piano. He let his fingers move across the keys without thinking, allowing the music to flow freely. The notes filled the empty hall, echoing softly off the walls. He remembered the first time he had played here, the fear, the pain, and the doubt that had held him back. But now everything felt different. The music wasn't just about him anymore. It was about the people he inspired, the students he taught, the orchestra he guided. As the weeks passed, Daniel became known not only as a pianist, but as a mentor and a leader. Musicians, young and old, sought his advice. Even the conductor began to consult him regularly, asking for input on arrangements, interpretations, and performance techniques. Daniel had never sought power or recognition, but he found himself in a position where his knowledge and experience were deeply respected. The hall began to host special concerts featuring Daniel alongside the orchestra. People from across the city came to hear him play, and the performances were consistently moving. Each concert told a story, not just through the music, but through the way Daniel played. He had a unique ability to connect with the audience, to make them feel every emotion embedded in the notes. One evening, after a particularly moving performance, a woman approached him. She had tears in her eyes and spoke with a voice trembling from emotion. "Your music. It saved me," she said. "I was going through a difficult time, and hearing you play gave me hope." Daniel was silent for a moment, overwhelmed by the weight of her words. He had never imagined that his music could touch someone so deeply. He only nodded, saying softly, "I'm glad it helped." That night, Daniel walked home slowly, reflecting on the changes in his life. He had gone from being a quiet janitor to a celebrated pianist, mentor, and leader, yet he had not lost himself. He remained humble, kind, and dedicated to the people around him. His music was no longer a secret, but his heart remained grounded. As he approached his apartment, he looked up at the stars and smiled. Life had given him a second chance, not just to play, but to inspire, to teach, and to heal. The journey was far from over, and he knew there would be challenges ahead. But for the first time in many years, he felt truly at peace. Inside the hall, the piano rested under the soft glow of the lights, waiting for the next note, the next story, the next moment of magic. Daniel knew that as long as he played, the music would never end, and neither would the hope it carried for everyone who listened. The following weeks were a blend of excitement and routine for Daniel. Every morning he cleaned the hall with his usual quiet diligence, but by afternoon, he was practicing, teaching, or helping the orchestra perfect their pieces. His days were long and tiring, yet they were filled with a sense of purpose he hadn't felt in years. Word of his talent had spread far beyond the city. Invitations came from other concert halls, music festivals, and even international orchestras, all eager to witness the hidden maestro who had risen from obscurity. Daniel read the letters carefully, feeling both honored and apprehensive. He had never sought fame, and the thought of traveling for performances made him uneasy. Yet he understood that his music could inspire more people if he shared it widely. Back at the hall, he continued to mentor the young girl, who had become increasingly confident with each lesson. Her enthusiasm reminded Daniel of the joy of learning, the thrill of discovery, and the pure love of music untainted by fear or expectation. Sometimes he found himself lost in her excitement, laughing at her mistakes and celebrating her successes as if they were his own. One afternoon, as Daniel was finishing his practice, Roland approached him quietly. "There's something I'd like to ask you," he said, looking hesitant. "The board has proposed a special gala in your honor. They want you to perform, and the orchestra will accompany you. It's a formal event with many dignitaries and critics attending." Daniel felt a pang of anxiety. He was no stranger to performing, but the idea of being formally recognized and placed in the spotlight made him nervous. He shook his head gently. "I appreciate the offer, sir, but I don't perform for accolades. I play for the music itself." Roland studied him for a moment, then nodded. "I understand. But think about it this way. Your music could touch people who've never heard it before. You have a chance to inspire them, just as you've inspired all of us here." Daniel took a deep breath and considered it. Perhaps this was more than just a performance. Perhaps it was an opportunity to share the healing power of music on a greater scale. "All right," he said quietly. "I'll do it." Preparation for the gala became intense. The orchestra rehearsed tirelessly, with Daniel taking the lead and guiding the musicians, suggesting subtle changes and ensuring that the performance would be flawless. Every evening he stayed late, playing through the pieces again and again, making sure that every note carried emotion, every pause held meaning. The young girl continued to watch and learn, absorbing not only the technical skills but also Daniel's dedication and humility. She observed how he treated the musicians and the audience, understanding that music was not just sound but a connection between souls. She had never seen anyone care so deeply about sharing their art, and it inspired her to work even harder. Finally, the night of the gala arrived. The hall was packed, shimmering with chandeliers and the soft glow of candles. Guests dressed in elegant attire, critics whispered among themselves, and the orchestra waited with anticipation. Daniel stood backstage, feeling the familiar rush of nerves tempered by a quiet determination. Roland came to him one last time. "Remember," he said softly, "play for the music. Let it speak through you and everything else will follow." Daniel nodded. He took a deep breath, closed his eyes for a moment, and then stepped onto the stage. The audience erupted in applause, but he paid it no mind. His fingers hovered over the keys, and then as the first notes flowed, silence fell. The audience listened, rapt, as if the music had created a world of its own, separate from everything else. The performance was extraordinary. Daniel poured all his experiences, his pain, his joy, and his love into the piano. Every note told a story. Every chord carried emotion. Every pause allowed the audience to breathe and feel. The orchestra followed his lead seamlessly, enhancing the depth and richness of the music without overshadowing it. As he played, Daniel caught glimpses of the audience's reactions. Tears rolled down the cheeks of some, while others smiled softly, lost in memories evoked by the music. He could see people leaning forward, holding their breath, completely absorbed in the story he was telling without words. This was more than he had ever imagined. His music was touching hearts in ways he had only dreamed of. When the final note faded into silence, the hall remained still for a heartbeat longer, as if the audience could not let go of what they had experienced. Then an eruption of applause filled the space, louder and more heartfelt than anything Daniel had ever heard. Standing ovations swept across the room, people cheering, clapping, and whistling in admiration. Daniel stood and bowed, overwhelmed by the intensity of the moment. He had never sought such recognition, yet it was humbling to see the impact his music had on so many people. For the first time he felt that his gift had truly found its purpose, not just in the hall he cleaned, not just for the orchestra, but for every soul who had listened and felt. After the gala, Daniel was approached by several people who wanted to know more about his journey. Some were aspiring musicians, others were struggling in their own lives, seeking inspiration. He spoke to them quietly, humbly, sharing lessons he had learned about perseverance, passion, and finding joy in what one loves to do. He never boasted, never sought to be the center of attention. He simply spoke from the heart. The young girl watched him from the back, absorbing every word. She understood now that being a great musician was not just about talent. It was about dedication, humility, and the willingness to give without expecting anything in return. Daniel had shown her what it truly meant to be an artist. In the days that followed, Daniel returned to his routines at the hall. He cleaned the floors, polished the instruments, and prepared for rehearsals. But the atmosphere had changed. Musicians now sought his advice before rehearsals. Young students asked for lessons, and even the conductor treated him as an equal, respecting his judgment and guidance. Daniel never let the fame distract him from his purpose. He continued to teach, to mentor, and to play. He understood that his life had been given a second chance, and he intended to use it wisely. Music was no longer just a personal solace. It had become a way to connect, inspire, and heal others. One evening, after a long day of rehearsals and teaching, Daniel sat alone at the piano. The hall was empty, the lights dimmed, and the air was still. He let his fingers move over the keys gently, playing a melody that came from deep within him. It was a melody of gratitude, of memories, of hope, and of love. Each note was a reminder of the journey he had taken, from loss and silence to rediscovery and purpose. He paused, listening to the fading echoes of the hall. It was in that silence that he realized how far he had come. The janitor, who had once been overlooked and underestimated, had found his voice again. He had touched countless lives, inspired the next generation, and reclaimed the joy that music had always given him. Daniel smiled softly, his heart full. Outside, the city lights twinkled, reflecting the possibilities of tomorrow. Inside, the piano waited, patient and ready for the next story, The next song, the next moment of magic. And Daniel knew he would be there, hands poised, heart open, ready to play for anyone willing to listen. The days following the gala were filled with a quiet satisfaction for Daniel. Life at the concert hall settled into a rhythm, blending work, music, and teaching. The hall, once just a place he cleaned, had become a space of purpose and inspiration. Musicians, students, and visitors all looked at him differently now. But Daniel remained humble, quietly moving through his duties with the same gentle diligence he had always possessed. The young girl he had been teaching was growing into a confident pianist. Her talent was blooming, nurtured by Daniel's guidance and the patience he showed. Watching her practice reminded him of his own early days, and sometimes he could almost see himself in her determination and excitement. One evening she stopped mid-practice, looking up at him with wide eyes. "I want to play on a big stage someday," she said. "Just like you." Daniel smiled, feeling a warmth in his chest. "You can," he said gently. "But remember, it's not about the size of the stage or the applause. It's about the music you carry inside and the joy you feel when you share it." As he spoke, he realized how far he had come himself. From a janitor who feared the spotlight, he had become someone who could inspire others simply by sharing what he loved. Yet he had never let it change him. Fame had not made him proud or arrogant. It had made him more aware of the responsibility his music carried. One afternoon, a group of young musicians from a local school visited the hall for a workshop. Daniel guided them through exercises, demonstrating techniques and encouraging them to find their own voice in the music. He listened patiently to their mistakes, offered advice, and praised their progress. The children were captivated not just by his skill but by his genuine kindness. He showed them that mastery was not just about playing notes correctly, but about expressing feelings, telling a story, and connecting with others. Later, Daniel found himself alone in the hall, seated at the grand piano. He let his fingers glide across the keys, playing a melody that was both soft and powerful. As he played, memories of the past mingled with the present. His early years of study, the loss that had silenced him, the nights he spent hidden in the hall, and the recent moments of triumph. Each note carried a piece of his journey, a reflection of the life he had lived and the hope he had regained. Roland entered quietly, standing at the back of the stage and listening without interruption. He had watched Daniel transform the hall and the musicians around him. He realized that this man, whom he had once dismissed as just a janitor, had a presence and wisdom far beyond what he had expected. Daniel's music was not just technical. It was alive, full of emotion and capable of touching hearts in ways words never could. When Daniel finished, Roland approached him. "You've done more than play," he said softly. "You've changed this hall, these musicians, and even me. I underestimated you for too long." Daniel shrugged modestly. "I just do what I love," he replied. "If it helps others, that's enough." Roland smiled, a rare warmth in his expression. "You've shown me that talent and humility can coexist. That's something I'll never forget." News of Daniel's performances continued to spread. Invitations arrived from other cities and some from other countries. Each offer was carefully considered, as Daniel wanted to maintain his connection to the hall that had become his sanctuary. He agreed to travel for a few select performances, but always returned home, knowing that the place and people who had witnessed his journey deserved his presence most. One day, a renowned music critic visited the hall. Daniel was nervous not because of the critique but because he understood the weight of opinions in the music world. He sat at the piano and played a piece of his own composition, letting the notes speak for him. The critic listened intently, eyes closed, taking in every nuance and emotion. When the last note faded, the critic opened his eyes and smiled. "I have never heard anything so genuine," he said. "Your music carries truth, honesty, and depth. You are extraordinary." Daniel bowed slightly, feeling a quiet pride, but he never let the praise change him. His purpose was not recognition, but the music itself. He had learned that true fulfillment came from sharing one's passion and witnessing the impact it had on others. Evenings at the hall became a time of reflection. Daniel often sat alone, playing melodies that he had composed over the years. Each tune held a memory, a feeling, a story. The hall absorbed his music, echoing it softly as if it understood his soul. Sometimes he would close his eyes and imagine the faces of the people who had been touched by his performances. The students, the musicians, the audience members. and a sense of peace would wash over him. The young girl continued to grow under his mentorship. One night after a long practice session, she looked up and said, "I want to perform for people like you. Not to be famous, but to make them feel something like you do." Daniel's eyes glistened. "That's exactly why you should play," he said. "Never play for recognition. Play for the hearts of those who listen." Months passed, and Daniel's influence spread further. Musicians from other orchestras came to learn from him, and students from far away sought lessons. But no matter how busy he became, he always returned to his cleaning duties, always returned to the hall that had given him a second chance. It grounded him, reminded him of where he had started, and kept him humble. One evening, after a particularly moving rehearsal, Daniel sat at the piano and played a piece that had been lingering in his mind for days. The music was gentle at first, then powerful, then soft again, as if telling a story without words. Roland and the orchestra listened, completely captivated. The young girl, who had grown into a skilled pianist herself, sat nearby, her eyes wide with admiration. When the final chord faded, the hall was silent for a moment, absorbing the beauty that had just passed. Then applause slowly rose, growing louder and louder. Daniel smiled, feeling the warmth of the moment. It wasn't about praise or recognition. It was about connection, about the invisible threads that music could weave between people. As the night ended, Daniel walked through the empty hall one last time. The chandeliers glimmered, the polished floors reflected the soft lights, and the piano rested silently, waiting for the next melody. Daniel paused, placing a hand on the piano, and whispered, "Thank you for being here with me all these years." Outside, the city was quiet, the streets shimmering under the moonlight. Inside, the hall held its breath, carrying the echoes of music, laughter, learning, and inspiration. Daniel had begun as a janitor, overlooked and underestimated, yet he had become something far greater, not through fame but through passion, perseverance, and the willingness to share his gift with the world. The story of the hidden pianist spread, inspiring countless people. Yet Daniel remained unchanged, grounded in humility and dedicated to the power of music. He had proven that greatness can exist in the most unexpected places, that a person's worth is not defined by titles or appearances, and that the true measure of talent lies in the heart and soul. And so, Daniel continued his journey, playing, teaching, and inspiring. The hall, once a place of work and routine, had become a sanctuary of hope and creativity. Each day the music flowed through him, touching hearts, bridging gaps, and leaving a legacy far greater than any applause could measure. The janitor had become a maestro, not because the world said so, but because he had the courage to let his music speak for itself. And in doing so, he transformed the lives of everyone who listened.